The moment this came out, the entire direction of the Iran nuclear story shifted. And almost nobody is explaining why. Early this morning, reports confirmed that Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi arrived in St. Petersburg for a high-stakes meeting with Vladimir Putin. And within hours, the Kremlin, through spokesman Dmitry Peskov, made one thing very clear. Russia's offer to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium is still on the table. Not a rumor, not speculation, a real active proposal. And then came the line that should make everyone pause. It still has not been acted on. 4 simple words. But those 4 words reveal a major geopolitical deadlock that most people are completely missing. Because underneath the headlines, something much bigger is happening. For months, the United States has repeated one central demand in every negotiation, every back-channel conversation, every diplomatic signal. Iran must part with its enriched uranium. Not reduce it, not pause it, remove it. We're talking about roughly 450 kilograms enriched to 60%. Material that can be pushed to an extremely sensitive threshold in a very short window. In other words, this is not just another item on a long list of conditions. This is the item every pause proposal, every indirect round of talks, every political message eventually circles back to this same point. And now, out of nowhere, Russia steps in with a solution that, at least on paper, answers the whole problem. Moscow is essentially saying, give us the uranium. We will take it out of Iran. We will store it on Russian soil. We will reprocess it under international supervision. Iran keeps its nuclear infrastructure. The most sensitive material leaves the country. The wider international community, including the International Atomic Energy Agency, can monitor the entire process. No regional shock, no sudden spiral. Just a diplomatic off-ramp that could cool down one of the most tense files in the world. But here's where everything turns. This proposal, the one that checks almost every major box, was not accepted. And that raises the real question driving this entire story. If a solution exists that lowers tension, addresses the core demand, and creates a path toward regional stability, why was it turned down? Let me put this as clearly as possible, because a lot of coverage is circling around it. Instead of saying it directly, Donald Trump rejected Vladimir Putin's offer to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium. That is not a theory. That was confirmed in reporting where U.S. officials said plainly that it had not been accepted. Now, on the surface, Washington's position sounds reasonable. Officials keep saying, we need to see the uranium secured. But that phrase hides the real disagreement. The United States agrees with the goal. It does not agree with the method. Washington wants uranium out of Iran, just not in Russian hands. And that distinction, which looks small on paper, is actually the entire story. Because look at what happened next. While Washington hesitates, Abbas Araghchi gets on a plane and flies straight to St. Petersburg to sit down with Putin. That is not a routine diplomatic visit. That is a signal. Iran is effectively responding with its actions. If America will not accept Russia as a channel, then Iran is going to speak with Russia directly anyway. And to understand why this moment matters, you have to go back not a few months, but several years to the foundation of this whole issue. Under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal that Trump exited in 2018, Russia was already playing this exact role. Iran shipped out roughly 97% of its enriched uranium stockpile. And where did it go? Russia. It was handled by Rosatom, stored, processed, and monitored under international oversight. And here's the key point that keeps getting overlooked. That system worked. There were no major compliance breakdowns. No credible signs that the material disappeared into some unknown channel. No serious collapse in oversight. The International Atomic Energy Agency verified compliance for years. The arrangement functioned the way it was designed to function until the United States stepped away from the deal and restored sanctions. So when Dmitry Peskov says today that Russia is the only country with positive experience handling Iran's uranium, he is not just promoting Moscow. He is pointing to a documented track record. This is not some imaginary idea. It is a replay of a system that already worked once before. Russia has the infrastructure. Russia has the legal framework. Russia has the storage capacity. Russia already has working experience with the IAEA on this specific file. And that means technically, diplomatically, and historically, the mechanism is sitting right there. Russia is ready. Iran is engaging. The IAEA can supervise. Everything lines up. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question that much of the Western coverage keeps skimming past. Why reject it? The answer has less to do with uranium itself and more to do with leverage. Washington's concern, based on the reporting, is that allowing Russia to take and process Iran's uranium would strengthen Moscow's position in the global nuclear energy market. Russia, through Rosatom, already controls a major share of global uranium enrichment and nuclear fuel supply. If Moscow takes Iran's stockpile, processes it, and potentially reintroduces it into the global fuel chain, that increases Russia's reach across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. For the United States, which has spent years trying to reduce dependence on Russian nuclear services, that is a strategic setback. And to be fair, that concern is not irrational. It is a coherent geopolitical calculation. But here is the cost of making that calculation. By rejecting Russia as the custodian, the U.S. is effectively insisting that Iran give up its uranium through a channel that does not benefit Russia. The problem is, those alternative channels barely exist. In reality, Iran is extremely unlikely to hand over this material directly to the United States. It is also highly unlikely to trust close U.S. partners like France or Japan with it. And the idea of neutralizing the uranium inside Iran would require a level of cooperation and trust that simply is not there right now. So what you are left with is a paradox. The United States wants the uranium gone. Russia is offering a proven way to remove it. Iran is willing to discuss it. But because of who controls the solution, not what the solution accomplishes, the deal stalls. And that is exactly why today's meeting in St. Petersburg matters far more than it first appears. So where does that leave Washington now? In a much tighter position than it may want to admit. By rejecting Putin's uranium proposal, the United States has effectively narrowed its own options. The only mechanism on the table with a real track record has already been dismissed. And while American officials look for an alternative that does not currently exist, one basic fact remains unchanged. Iran's enriched uranium is still inside Iran. That means the pressure continues. Instability in energy markets continues. Oil prices stay elevated. And the broader regional standoff keeps drifting without a clear off-ramp. Now look at Iraqchi's move today in that context. His flight to St. Petersburg is not just diplomacy, it is strategy. Iran understands exactly the position Washington has created for itself. Tehran knows the Russian mechanism was rejected. It knows there is no ready substitute. And most importantly, it knows that without resolving the uranium issue, the United States cannot bring this episode to a close on its own terms. So instead of waiting, Iran is leaning into the one channel that still exists, Russia. And then Arachi adds another layer when he speaks to Iranian state media. He describes the visit as a good opportunity for consultations with Moscow and says these discussions are especially important at this stage. That phrase matters. At this stage signals urgency, timing, and leverage. It tells you this is not routine coordination. This is a moment when influence is shifting, talks are stalled, Washington is hesitating. The uranium question remains unresolved. And inside that vacuum, Russia's role does not shrink, it expands. Why? Because, as Peskov confirmed, the offer is still there. The mechanism exists. And by physically showing up in Russia, Iran is sending a message without needing to say it outright. The solution is available, it is operational, it is waiting. But the United States chose not to use it. At the same time, Iran is making sure that if Washington eventually rethinks its position, or if pressure grows from global markets and allies who depend on stability around key trade routes like the Strait of Hormuz, the infrastructure for a deal is already in place. Now add China to the picture, because what Beijing is not saying may be just as important as what Moscow is saying. Before Arachi even boarded his flight, he spoke with Wang Yi. That call happened before consultations with several regional players, which tells you something important about priority and alignment. China had early visibility into Iran's thinking before others, and possibly before key developments became public. And yet today, China has remained almost completely silent. No major public comments on the visit, no visible reaction to the uranium proposal, no dramatic positioning. But that silence should not be mistaken for distance. China's relationship with Iran's strategic programs runs deep. There have been multiple intelligence assessments pointing to Chinese components within Iran's advanced systems, and Iran's broader technology ecosystem has long relied on both Russian and Chinese inputs. Just days ago, China and Russia held discussions with the International Atomic Energy Agency specifically about Iran's nuclear program. That sequence matters. The IABI meeting looks like a coordination stage. Today's meeting in St. Petersburg looks much more like an implementation stage. And China is observing from a position of quiet leverage. It is the country that has already secured long-term energy ties with Iran and has enough economic influence to shape outcomes without dominating the headlines. Which brings us back to the structural problem facing Washington. This is not just a diplomatic disagreement, it is a strategic dilemma. The United States needs Iran's uranium removed. Russia has the capability and the experience to remove it. Washington rejected that path, and right now there's no equally viable alternative that Iran is likely to accept. That leaves only two real possibilities. Either the US eventually reconsiders the Russian mechanism, or it starts leaning toward a far riskier outside approach to dealing with the material inside Iran. And think about what that would actually mean. That would not be a diplomatic solution. That would create a much more unpredictable situation. It would likely collapse any temporary pause framework, require extremely complex coordination, and almost certainly trigger reactions that spread uncertainty across the region. And so this is the reality right now, as our chief sits across from Putin in St. Petersburg. The only peaceful mechanism currently visible for removing Iran's uranium is the one offered by Russia and rejected by the United States. And while that standoff continues, conditions on the ground keep getting more fragile. Maritime pressure rises, economic strain builds, and the diplomatic window that was supposed to open during this period grows narrower. Now here's where it becomes especially hard to ignore. Donald Trump himself said the uranium issue is 99% of the deal. That is not someone else's interpretation. That is his framing. J.D. Vance echoed the same basic idea. So if the uranium question represents almost the entire agreement, and the only workable mechanism to address it has already been turned down, then what you are really looking at is this. The United States has blocked 99% of its own pathway to a deal. That is not a small setback. That is the center of the whole process. And that is exactly why Irakchi is in St. Petersburg with Vladimir Putin right now. This meeting is not about deciding whether Russia will take the uranium. That part has already been signaled. This meeting is about details, the timeline, the verification framework with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the technical safeguards, and most importantly, the guarantees that Russia cannot simply convert this into another source of market leverage. And here's the key insight. Those are solvable problems. These are not impossible geopolitical walls. They are engineering questions, legal questions, regulatory questions. They can be negotiated, structured, and monitored. And Iran is in Russia right now precisely because the larger strategic question already looks settled from its side. Russia is willing. Iran is open. The IAEA can oversee it. The only missing piece is a yes from Washington. Now, to be fair, there is a counter-argument, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Russia is not doing this out of pure generosity. Putin is not offering to take Iran's uranium simply as a favor to the international community. Moscow would gain from this. It would strengthen Russia's role in the global nuclear fuel chain. It would position Russia as a central player in any post-crisis regional framework. And from Washington's perspective, giving that kind of strategic advantage to Moscow is a genuine concern. That skepticism is real and is grounded in actual geopolitical competition. But here is the more important question, not whether Russia benefits, whether the alternative is better, because the alternative is what we are watching right now, a prolonged deadlock, a temporary pause that feels more symbolic than durable, rising tension around key trade routes like the Strait of Hormuz, elevated oil prices rippling through global markets, and most importantly, Iran's enriched uranium still sitting inside Iran unchanged and unresolved. When you compare those outcomes, the cost of rejecting the Russian mechanism starts to look heavier than the benefit of denying Moscow additional influence. That is the calculation Washington made. And that calculation is exactly why Irakchi is in St. Petersburg today, while the United States is effectively waiting for another answer to appear. Looking ahead, the next phase of this story may matter even more. What is likely happening behind closed doors right now is not abstract discussion, it is refinement. Russia is expected to present a more detailed and updated version of its uranium custody proposal, more specific than the earlier version. That would likely include clear timelines for transfer, defined storage conditions, structured IAEA oversight, and crucially, explicit limits on what Russia can do with the material once it has it. That last part goes directly to the American concern. Questions about resale, reprocessing, and market leverage sit at the center of Washington's objection. If this updated proposal includes binding guarantees, real constraints that limit Russia's ability to turn Iran's uranium into a broader geopolitical asset without wider consent, then the core U.S. concern is at least partially addressed. From there, the next step becomes diplomatic transmission. Arachi carries the framework back to Tehran. It moves through regional intermediaries. It eventually lands back on Washington's desk. And at that point, the decision becomes impossible to postpone. Accept the mechanism or reject it again. If it is accepted, the implications are immediate. The uranium issue, the famous 99%, begins to move toward resolution. Pressure on global trade routes eases. A path towards stabilizing the broader situation opens. But if it is rejected again, the consequences are just as clear. The deadlock continues. And the diplomatic record begins to tell a very specific story. Iran signaled willingness. Russia provided a mechanism. The United States declined twice. The narrative matters. It shapes alignments. It affects how future negotiations are framed. And it influences how other capitals read American flexibility and follow through. And then there is China, quiet but very much present. Wang Yi and Beijing have chosen strategic silence. No dramatic statement, no visible public pressure, no headline-grabbing posture. But behind that silence is influence. China continues to buy Iranian oil, giving Tehran economic breathing room. It has already engaged in discussions with Russia and the IAEA on Iran's nuclear issue. It functions as a stabilizing partner for Iran, not by speaking loudly, but by making sure Iran has the capacity to wait. In many ways, China is shaping the environment without stepping into the spotlight. It is present without looking present. And that quiet presence is exactly what allows Iran to sit in St. Petersburg today, speaking with Russia instead of rushing to respond to Washington. Which brings us back to the simplest image in this entire story. Donald Trump said there was a line of communication, a path forward, a way to move this ahead. But that line has not been used. Instead, Arachi is sitting across from Putin discussing a mechanism that already exists, while the one country that needs that mechanism most has still not accepted it. Now let me add one more layer because this may be the most important part of all, and it goes far beyond uranium. In January 2025, just weeks before the situation intensified, Iran and Russia signed a 20-year strategic partnership agreement. This was not a symbolic photo op. It was one of the most comprehensive bilateral frameworks either country has entered into in modern years. It covers economic cooperation, strategic coordination, and deep political alignment. It deliberately stops short of becoming a formal mutual security pact, but the level of integration it creates is still significant. So when Abbas Araghchi lands in St. Petersburg today to meet Vladimir Putin, he is not walking into the room as a diplomat asking an outsider for help. He is arriving as a representative of a treaty partner coordinating strategy with an aligned power, and that changes the meaning of this meeting. This is not Russia casually stepping into someone else's problem as a neutral middleman. This is Russia being briefed, consulted, and potentially aligned by a country with which it now has long-term strategic commitments. That means the conversation behind closed doors is not just about can Russia help solve this. It is also about how both sides can position themselves inside this moment to maximize their outcomes. Because Russia's interests here are not abstract. They are concrete, they are measurable, and in many ways they are economically beneficial. During the peak of recent tension, when disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz pushed global oil prices higher, Russia's energy revenues climbed sharply. Reports suggested Moscow was bringing in hundreds of millions of euros per day during that period. That is not incidental, that is structural. Every day global supply feels tighter. Every day prices stay elevated. Russia benefits. So the longer instability continues, the more financially useful the situation becomes for Moscow. Now think about that in the context of what Peskov said, that the uranium offer still stands. On the surface, it looks like a constructive, solution-oriented proposal, and it may well be. But beneath that sits a deeper question. What outcome does Russia actually prefer? A fast resolution that cools markets and reduces its windfall, or a longer process in which Russia positions itself as the indispensable problem solver, offering the only credible mechanism while also benefiting from the instability surrounding the issue. This is not about claiming Russia is acting without sincerity. It is about understanding incentives. Russia's position allows it to gain in multiple scenarios. If the deal is accepted, Moscow becomes the central custodian of Iran's nuclear material, expands its role in the global nuclear fuel market, and earns diplomatic credit as the country that helped unlock a major international deadlock. If the deal is rejected, Russia can still benefit economically from elevated energy prices and politically as U.S. credibility comes under increasing strain with every passing week of unresolved diplomacy. And when you zoom out, China's posture mirrors this logic in a quieter form. Beijing, represented by figures like Wang Yi, has remained restrained in public, but its strategic posture is clear. China benefits from continued access to Iranian energy, often under favorable conditions. It benefits from disruptions that weaken Western influence in global markets. And it benefits from a geopolitical climate where the United States appears unable to finalize its own preferred outcome. China does not need to dominate the headlines to shape the result. Its role is quieter, but just as consequential. By maintaining economic engagement with Iran and coordinating on key moments with Russia and international bodies like the IAEA, China creates an environment in which Iran can remain patient. That patience lowers urgency in Tehran while increasing pressure on Washington. So when you look at St. Petersburg today, you are not just looking at a meeting about uranium, you are looking at the convergence of long-term partnerships, economic incentives, and geopolitical positioning. Iran is coordinating with a treaty partner. Russia is balancing opportunity and influence. China is shaping the environment from the background. And the United States is trying to navigate all of this while defending a position that currently has no clear mechanism for achieving its own stated goal. That is why this moment matters. Not just because of what is being discussed, but because of what it reveals about who holds leverage, who benefits from delay, and who ultimately gets to shape the endgame. What you are watching right now is a strategy problem, not just a diplomacy problem. The United States is applying pressure on Iran, but Iran's two most important partners, Russia and China, both gain when that pressure continues. That is a structural imbalance. It means every sanction, every delay, every stalled round of talks does not just squeeze Iran, it also strengthens the position of the country standing beside it. And that is exactly what our Xi is doing in St. Petersburg right now. He is not just discussing uranium with Vladimir Putin. He is aligning strategy. He is making sure that when the next round of talks begins, Iran, Russia, and China are not reacting separately, but moving with the same general direction in mind. Because when Donald Trump says the uranium issue is 99% of the deal, and Russia is openly offering to solve that 99%, but the United States says no, Iran's next move becomes very deliberate. It sends its foreign minister directly to the country holding the mechanism. Not quietly, not invisibly, but openly, publicly in real time. This is no longer just negotiation, it is demonstration. Iran is showing Washington and the wider world that a solution exists, that it is operational, and that it is being actively discussed, just not accepted. And that is why today's meeting matters so much. Russia is effectively holding up the mechanism. Iran is standing beside it. And Eric Xi is making sure that every observer, every mediator, every regional power, every ally watching the situation understands one simple point. The solution is not missing. It is sitting on the table. The only question is, who is choosing not to pick it up? Now add what happened over the weekend, because this is where everything starts connecting. Iran did not make just one move, it made two at the same time. Through Pakistani intermediaries, Iran presented a new proposal to the United States. The idea was straightforward but strategically sharp. Separate the Strait of Hormuz problem from the nuclear issue. Reopen Hormuz quickly. Stabilize global markets, ease economic pressure. And then deal with the nuclear file later on a separate track. That is a rapid relief option. A way to give Washington and its partners an immediate win without forcing the hardest issue to be solved first. At the exact same time, Iran sends Arakchi to Moscow to reinforce the second track, the longer-term answer. The uranium issue, the 99%, already has a mechanism. Russia has it. It has been offered, and it is still available. So in one weekend, Iran presents two exits. One immediate, one structural, one to calm the market now. One to resolve the central issue once the political conditions are ready. And the critical point is this. Those are not two separate stories. They are one coordinated strategy. The Hormuz proposal is Iran saying, we understand your urgency. We know your partners need stability. We can give you that. The Moscow visit is Iran saying, and when you are ready to solve the hard part, the answer is already built. It is a dual-track approach designed to give the United States flexibility, leverage, and choice, but Washington accepted neither. Instead, the response was to pull back, cancel engagement, and say, call us. And that gap is what defines this moment. On one side, Iran is holding open two different pathways toward de-escalation. On the other, the United States is not stepping into either one, and that gap between available solutions and the willingness to act on them is what this entire situation is really about right now. So look at the map. Russia is holding one option in St. Petersburg. Pakistan is carrying another through Islamabad. China is quietly sustaining Iran's economic capacity from Beijing. And the United States is waiting for a call that has not come. That is not just diplomacy. That is a deadlock shaped by hesitation, visibility, and timing. And right now, every move being made from Moscow to Islamabad seems designed to make that hesitation impossible to ignore.